Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Peter Redpath for once again pulling together a very interesting conference. And secondly, I'd like to make the point that given the theme of the conference, I was debating whether or not to present Etienne Gilson's thought on atheism, which I did in a recent article published in the Journal of Christian Apologetics. And I dedicated the article to Michael Mangini. So if you're interested in that, you can pass this around. What I did decide to do is to give a more broad brush approach to Gilson's contribution. And in attempting that, I stumbled upon Anton Pegas's comment when he published a Gilson Reader over 60 years ago. He attempted to try to capture Gilson in one volume. At the time, Gilson had 648 titles, including 3 scores of books. Pegas's comment was, if it has taken Etienne Gilson so many books to say what he had to say and to discuss what interested him, how can anyone present him in one volume? My predicament is that Gilson lived another 21 years, during which he remained intellectually active and published even more books, numerous articles, and reviews. So now I'm going to try to capture Gilson in one short lecture. To try to attempt at least a modicum of success, I'm going to focus primarily on the formative influences on Gilson, especially on his methodology, and sketch a few of his enduring accomplishments which flowed from it. So first of all, Gilson's academic formation. Born in Paris on a Friday the 13th, in June 1884, Gilson was educated by Christian brothers at the Paris School of Sainte-Clotilde, an excellent Catholic secondary school, the Petit Séminaire de Notre-Dame-des-Champs, and the Lycée Henri IV for 1 year, where he first encountered Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, the philosopher and historian of philosophy who was lecturing on David Hume and transitioning into a sociologist. After 1 year of military service, Gilson attended the Sorbonne and nearby College de France, where he heard the lectures of Henri Bergson. As a young student, Gilson confessed that he was already plagued with the incurable metaphysical disease he called chosisme, loosely translated thingism, or maybe even thingitis. That is crass realism, or thinking about things, not ideas. For Gilson, the hard solidity of the world would always remain an article of sanity. His initial reading and rereading of Descartes' Meditations and Leon Braunschweig's Introduction to the Life of the Spirit resulted in his understanding very little of them and being struck by the amazing arbitrariness he found in them. Fortunately, Blaise Pascal, an author whom Gilson loved, wrote not about notions or ideas like Descartes, but about real objects, things, actually existing beings, and indicated a direction in philosophy much richer than the rationalism and positivism so prevalent at the Sorbonne. This allowed Gilson to avoid despairing of philosophy. So he gave up the dream of a life devoted to the study and teaching of the humanities and went to study philosophy at the Faculty of Letters in the University of Paris. Immediately after passing the agrégation in philosophy in 1907, Gilson began his doctoral work. For his introduction to scholasticism and St. Thomas Aquinas, Gilson remained forever indebted to his Jewish thesis director, Professor Lévy-Bruhl. The doctoral student affectionately described his director as an heir to the pure rationalism of the Enlightenment and the least medieval man he had ever known. But Gilson also recognized Lévy-Bruhl as a great and honest man and a sociologist of note, a man of almost uncanny intelligence with a surprising gift of seeing facts in an impartial, cold, and objective light, just as they were. For Gilson, understanding any philosophy would always mean presenting it as he had seen Professor Lévy-Bruhl approach Hume, beginning and ending with clarity, with profundity as an addition. Lévi-Brul, who never opened one of the works of St. Thomas Aquinas and never intended to, recommended that for his major and minor doctoral theses, Gilson study the vocabulary and eventually the matter borrowed from scholasticism by Descartes. Under Lévi-Brul, Gilson learned how to place philosophical texts in their proper historical context and not to try and impose a theory upon the text to which it was foreign. He also learned that rigorous demonstration is sometimes possible in the history of philosophy. Bergson taught him how to frame a philosophical question and to get beyond the prefabricated historical and philosophical opinions and go directly to the real. All of this culminated in Gilson closely examining Descartes' courses and textbooks used by him at the Jesuit College of La Flèche, the Thomism of his Jesuit professors, the Augustinianism of his friends, the new mathematics and physics, and theological controversies such as the question of grace. Gilson's groundbreaking research authoritatively established that real philosophy did not die out with the Greeks and initiate a dark age devoid of philosophical thought, because Descartes' philosophical idea of God and of human beings as creatures with spiritual and immortal souls have their source not in the philosophical treatises of the Greeks, but in the works of the medieval scholastics. Furthermore, Gilson's major thesis, La Liberté and Theology in Descartes, concluded that Descartes had vainly tried to solve, by means of his own famous method, philosophical problems whose only correct position and solution were inseparable from the method of St. Thomas Aquinas. From then on, interpreting St. Thomas's thought would occupy Gilson's research, reflection, and writing. As a philosopher apprentice, Gilson undertook his university studies with one reservation. He did not expect from them any revelation as to what he should think and believe. This had already been settled in his mind. What he wanted was to probe his own thinking and go to the root of his faith in the midst of indifferent or hostile surroundings, to grow, as he put it, in order to survive. One can detect the beginning of what would become a lifelong project, which gradually took form when Gilson studied others seeking an understanding of their faith. One can also understand Gilson's comment about indifferent or hostile surroundings, given the French anti-Catholicism of the Third Republic. The stated goal of Jules Ferry, the Minister of Education, to reconstitute society without God and King. The disestablishment of the Catholic Church in 1905, and the French government seizing Catholic church buildings and closing the theological faculties of Aix, Bordeaux, Lyon, Paris, and Rouen. Lévi-Brul also taught Gilson how to distinguish good sociology from bad, and how to appreciate the contributions to learning of scholars with whom he almost totally disagreed. For instance, Gilson utterly rejected Emile Durkheim's hostility to philosophy, but respected the man as a scholar, as a sociologist who submitted to truths such as he found them. Gilson took every course that Durkheim offered. Virtually all of Gilson's professors, Durkheim for sociology, Brunswick for general philosophy, Lévi-Brul for modern philosophy, Victor Delbos for philosophy, and Frederick Rau for ethics, and his entire university education were secular. Gilson's professors strove to be pure philosophers. They all sought to keep their philosophizing free from all metaphysics and any religious influence. But that did not preclude Gilson's friendships with them or his defense of the institution in which they taught. Gilson had a most cordial relationship with Professor Delbos and shared a deep love of music and enjoyed it with Lévi-Brul. Nor did Gilson and his fellow students differentiate their professors on the basis of their religious backgrounds. Nothing, according to Gilson, distinguished our masters from one another in the free exercise of reason. Our masters may well have told us how, in their opinion, we should think, but not one of them ever presumed to tell us what we should think. No authoritarian regime, no established church would have so scrupulously respected our intellectual freedom. The Sorbonne instilled in us an absolute respect for the truth. The so-called scientific sociologists within the Department of Philosophy at the Sorbonne taught Gilson how to integrate classical learning and rational judgment, thereby enlarging the perspective of whatever he examined. They also limited Gilson's philosophical development in two ways: the exaggerated authority the sociologists attributed to the rational interpretation of data led them to deny the importance of research techniques. Durkheim, for example, instead of becoming involved in field work, would accept data without too much concern for how it was gathered. Secondly, the sociologists denied metaphysics as a path to truth. Only in Bergson did Gilson experience a first-rate philosopher convincingly argue for the possibility and validity of metaphysics. The classical problems of metaphysics, said to be insoluble, Bergson showed to be inexhaustible. Gilson also valued Bergson's approach to the history of philosophy that attempted to go beyond the formulas in which the thought of a philosopher expressed itself to the simple movement which produces them, penetrates them, and confers on them an indivisible unity. And Gilson heeded Bergson's warning to constantly remake one's historical concepts supple enough to adhere more exactly to the historical reality they express. After his formal training, Gilson moves on to teaching, which is now why we go to Lille and to Strasbourg. World War I interrupted Gilson's first university appointment at Lille when he was mobilized and fought at the Verdun front. Captured in 1916, Sergeant Gilson spent 2 years as a prisoner of war. During these years, he studied St. Bonaventure, I think his feast day is today, lectured on Bergson, published an article on aesthetic judgments, learned to play tennis, perfected his English and German, and became fluent in Russian. Gilson had the gift of languages. Besides Aristotle and Virgil, he read the original text of Dante, Goethe, Shakespeare, and Dostoevsky. The charm of his precise, limpid, elegant, and distinctive French and English prose consistently reflected impeccable scholarship, a sense of humor, slight doses of French irony, and serious Catholicism. Following the war, Gilson returned to Lille, and in addition to regular university courses, he gave public lectures on St. Thomas Aquinas, modeled after Lévi-Brul's manner of presenting Hume's philosophy at the Sorbonne. So simple that a novice could capture it completely in taking notes, and so profound that a novice turned professor could always learn something new whenever returning to those notes. Gilson's discovery of the high quality of medieval thought that preceded Descartes, especially in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, gained the respect of scholars in France and abroad, and became the recurrent dominant chord of much of what Gilson said or wrote about during the next 20 years. His lectures on St. Thomas given at Lille appeared in 1919 as a 174-page volume entitled Thomism. This would be the first of 6 editions that recorded the lifelong evolution of Gilson's understanding of St. Thomas. In its final edition of 1965, it grew to 478 pages. In 1918, Gilson became part of the French mission to reopen the University of Strasbourg as a French university. This included erasing its German past and turning it into a showpiece for French culture. The Faculty of Letters retained aspects of the German seminar. It continued to be organized not around disciplines, but around institutes and centers of study, designed to encourage innovative research and interdisciplinary exchange. Gilson's colleagues at Strasbourg included the economic and social historians Lucien Febvre, who was head of the Center for Modern Studies, and Marc Bloch, the head of the Center for Medieval Studies. Both were trained in their careers and devoted to searching the past for keys to understanding man's current situation. Gilson had received no such comparable technical training as a historian, but frequent interactions with Febvre and especially Bloch, who was familiar with the methodologies of medieval history, provided Gilson with invaluable vicarious training as a medievalist. Bloch made a point of attending Gilson's seminars and publicly and privately questioned his evidence for his interpretive statements. As a result, Gilson began to look at medieval studies in a multidisciplinary manner, in a much wider context, not restricted by the doctrinaire methodologies of Durkheim or Lévi-Bruhl, or by his own readings of Aquinas and others. Gilson even began to envisage an institute where all medieval studies could be researched and taught in an integrated fashion, providing insights into humanity and civilization. So Gilson's formal and informal training set the stage for a return to Paris, where he concludes that the notion of Christian philosophy is valid as a methodology. For just over a decade, from 1921 to 32, Gilson held appointments at the Sorbonne in the history of medieval philosophy and at the École Pratique des Hautes Études as director of medieval theologies and philosophies. His genius consisted in breaking the traditional approach to the Middle Ages, which studied the period from the perspective of French rationalism, the Renaissance, or Thomism. Gilson's secular university education and teaching career in France facilitated his personal and revolutionary approach to medieval studies, which shared none of the prejudices or virtues of the scholars and teachers, most of them clerics educated in scholasticism in Catholic institutions. Gilson studied the Middle Ages from within its own awareness. With finesse and perspicacity, he went beyond the sources to place himself in the position of one medieval writer after another, to see each one in their time as they saw themselves, to interpret their work such as they and their contemporaries understood it, and not judge it according to categories or systems that were foreign to them. Gilson wished to revive these thinkers who were real people with their culture, personality, knowledge, ignorance, religious life, traditions, and innovations, and people who cast essential light on the origins of modern philosophy. At the Sorbonne, Gilson taught authoritatively on ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy, whereas at the École Pratique, which is with its emphasis on research practice, Gilson, with his students as peers, focused on analyzing a small number of texts using both traditional and new technologies and methodologies. Gilson did not follow the historians who found only theology and no philosophy in the medieval doctrinal systems, or who interpreted St. Thomas as the only philosopher in the 13th century, or who discovered only a single philosophy called scholasticism, consisting fundamentally of the philosophy of Aristotle. Gilson did find philosophy in the Middle Ages, but he could not imagine that St. Anselm, St. Thomas, St. Bonaventure, John Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham all taught the same philosophy. His study of the philosophy of St. Bonaventure, for example, showed that his notions of being, cause, intellect, and natural knowledge differed fundamentally from those of Aquinas. Gilson's in-depth study of other thinkers led him to establish the irreducible diversity of the medieval doctrinal systems and contribute in a decisive way to reconstituting a pluralistic medieval age. Gilson also came to understand theology and philosophy as not mutually exclusive notions, and concluded that medieval doctrinal systems were in fact theologies. As he pointed out, a conclusion drawn from faith cannot belong in philosophy, but that is not to say that a purely rational conclusion cannot belong in theology. Following his methodology that concepts must be measured by reality, Gilson used history to test his notion of a religious use of reason. In his masterpiece, The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, Gilson argued that historically, a decisive transformation of Greek philosophy occurred at the hands of medieval Christian theologians, and their theologies revealed themselves as the seedbed of authentically philosophical notions subsequently incorporated into the religiously neutral systems of modern Western philosophers. Gilson always maintained that true philosophy, taken absolutely and in itself, owes all its truth to its rationality and to nothing other than its rationality. And he did not think that precluded a Christian exercise of reason. Gilson called the concrete historical situation of Christians engaging in philosophy Christian philosophy. He described it generically as every philosophy which, although keeping the two orders of reason and faith formally distinct, nevertheless considers the Christian revelation as an indispensable aid to reason. According to Gilson, as a matter of history, it can be shown that for being Christian, philosophy became more rational. Hence his abiding reluctance to isolate philosophy from Christianity. While impressive historical scholars such as Marc Bloch may have been analyzing medieval men through plowing, irrigation methods, and harness making, Gilson's explorations at the École Pratique of a wide variety of medieval personages recognized the need to go beyond the method of his masters at the Sorbonne for interpreting modern philosophers and expand and refine his personal methodology to be able to analyze medieval theologians in terms of their theological and even spiritual context. Only such analyses, Gilson steadfastly maintained, provided textual interpretations or explanations that made sense, since theologies were nothing but the very movement of human minds and love, seeking truth about God in Scripture and in the study of his creatures. Now for a brief look at the methods Gilson used in his works. Gilson's curiosity of mind and his taste for things, for shows, explain his profound appreciation of the importance of documents. For it is only through a text that we have access to the views of a particular figure in history. Any author in question is precisely the author of a text. Other information about the author, society, cultural milieu, social and political factors, the intended audience, etc., are relevant only to the extent that they shed light on the text. Key to the methodology Gilson demanded of his pupils throughout his career was to remain in constant contact with the text, to read, reread, reflect on the text, learn the author's technical terminology, characteristic style, and vocabulary, and understand that nothing keeps faith with an author's thought. No historian's treatise, no translation, however carefully made, nothing except the author's own text in the very languages in which he wrote it. Gilson had little use for relying on secondary sources. Gilson employed a variety of historiographical techniques as evidenced by the three general types of books and articles he authored: studies of individual thinkers, general histories, and philosophical works. His superior intellectual acuity and psychological sympathy for the individuals he studied enabled him to become a penetrating exegete of medieval text and present the philosophies of particular men such as Augustine, Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, Scotus, and Descartes, along with the principal factors which influenced them. Second, Gilson's histories of philosophy focused more on the filiations of various ideas and doctrinal genealogies, the origin and development of new ideas, and their development or neglect in subsequent school or thought. Lucien Febvre described Gilson's 782-page Philosophy in the Middle Ages as, from beginning to end, a coherence of thought, security that comes from experience, attentive vigilance, and something strong, solid, and firm, which is the equivalent of Gilson's signature. Gilson, Febvre observed, intuitively knows how sometimes to go it alone, sometimes accompanied by his disciples, to the exact area of research so as to accomplish the work needed there, to animate young teens with his curiosity, to provoke new studies, the publication of text, and fruitful links and connections. The third and more typically Gilsonian category of writings is philosophical in nature. It includes works such as The Unity of Philosophical Experience and Being in Some Philosophers. As Armin Maurer has pointed out, in these works, Gilson masterfully uses the history of philosophy to philosophize and arrive at a philosophical understanding of the history of philosophy. Gilson describes his method in these works as a kind of intellectual experimentation on the philosophical data provided by history. It examines the premises laid down by philosophers and sees what flows from them, either in that particular philosophy or subsequent philosophies. Gilson showed how across the centuries, philosophers have mistakenly given in to reforming the philosophy of their times by using the method and structure of other science, such as theology, psychology, mathematics, physics, and sociology, that ultimately result in skepticism and undermine philosophical truth. But Gilson concluded on a positive note. Because man is by nature a metaphysical animal who seeks the truth of reality, philosophy will always bury its undertakers. As for a sound approach to metaphysics, Gilson advocated an existential metaphysics. A little more on that later on. Always concerned about vehicles for publishing research, Gilson spearheaded not only creation of special collections of books, such as the Medieval Studies collection at Vrane and the Islamic Study collection at Vrane, but also journals. In 1925, at the Salle de Manuscrits of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, Gilson fortuitously met the erudite and creative Dominican priest, Father Gabriel Ferri. Almost immediately, they developed a plan for a periodical devoted to the history of medieval thought, to include editions of text. Joseph Vrane agreed to be the publisher, and the first volume of the Archives d'Histoire Doctrinale et Littéraire du Moyen Âge appeared in 1926. It was in the Archive that Gilson published most of his historical studies. Special mention should be made of Gilson's studies of the Arab philosophers, whom he wanted to understand and interpret as they could have been seen in the 13th century. Realizing Oriental philosophy's importance in the development of medieval philosophy, Gilson even considered learning Arabic, but probably gave up on the idea because a colleague characterized that language as one of unfathomable richness, susceptible to multiple interpretations. That same enthusiasm and spirit of understanding likewise guided Gilson's impetus for studying medieval Jewish philosophy, which he never ceased to encourage. There's a new chapter in Gilson's life that emerges in the 1920s with the establishment of the Institute at Toronto. And I won't go into any detail regarding the two meetings that he has with the Basilian Fathers in 1927. He goes up to Toronto to discuss the possibility of an institute while he's a visiting professor at Harvard. He has another visit the following year in which they formalize things, and the institute opens up on September, September 29th, 1929. The only point I'd like to make is that, in a sense, the Institute stems from the methodology that he had in place at the École Pratique in Paris. just as he had a laboratory going on at the École Pratique, he sets up a similar, more grandiose laboratory in Toronto in the Institute. And he models that laboratory after the École Pratique. It consists of a library, mandatory introductory courses in medieval Latin, paleography, and historical sources, research seminars in medieval philosophy, theology, the history of positive sciences, political and social doctrines, the study of Jewish and Arabic thought, the influence exerted by medieval systems on art, literature, and politics, and a collaborative methodology that emphasizes text and documents. Because of his institute, and especially because of the curriculum, as well as the impressive cadre of philosophers, professors rather, that he is able to attract and retain, Toronto becomes a real showplace for medieval studies. So much so that one expert years later, in the 80s, I think, makes the comment, Toronto is the place where God sends all the good medievalists when they die, and where he sends most of the best medievalists long before they die. So now let's just turn briefly to Gilson's legacy, his later career and his enduring achievements. In 1932, when he was appointed the first holder of the chair of the history of medieval philosophy at the Collège de France, Gilson resigns from the Sorbonne and the École Pratique, but chooses to remain director of studies in Toronto, and he holds that position till late in life. In 1947, he was elected to a seat in the French Senate and honored by the highest distinction attainable by a French scholar, membership in the French Academy. After years of commuting between the Quartier Latin and the New World, more than 50 transatlantic crossings, Gilson resigned from his chair at the Collège de France in 1951 and directed the remainder of his active career to directing the Institute in Toronto until 1971, when he was 87 years old. Not surprisingly, Gilson's later lectures and books develop and deepen the signature themes of his earlier works: Thomism, Christian philosophy, and expositions of medieval figures. But we also find much that is new in areas such as aesthetics. Gilson's Mellon lectures on painting and his subsequent further reflections on art and beauty that included architecture, statuary, music, poetry, theater, and dance, as well as the condition of the arts as industrialized in a mass culture. Contemporary science, his philosophical reflections on linguistics and finality in nature and evolution. The history of philosophy, his mature and definitive interpretation of key figures in modern philosophy, along with a distinctive treatment of contemporary French and Italian philosophy. Literature, incomparable studies of Dante, Eloise, and Abelard, and other couples such as Petrarch and Laura, Richard Wagner and Mathilde, Auguste Comte and Clotilde de Vaux, which illustrate the relationship and conflict between the muse and the lover. And finally, autobiography, Gilson's fascinating, controversial, intellectual, and spiritual memoir. Gilson exhibited a hard-nosed, realistic appraisal of his own work. He considered it as open and to be surpassed by future scholarship. As he observed in the last edition of Thomism, grown old, the historian must at least have learned to be humble about his own opinions and to be considerate to those of others. There is a law of closed-mindedness. Although subsequent scholarship has challenged and corrected some of the contours and narratives of Gilson's contribution, much of his work has admirably stood the test of time. In concluding, I should like to highlight elements of Gilson's thought which illustrate Bergson's observation that when two or more independent insights cross, a new philosophy is born. Gilson may have considered himself as primarily a historian of philosophy whose main goal was to correctly interpret the imperfectly understood medieval tradition of Christian thought, especially the wisdom of Thomas Aquinas. But his executing that mission revealed Gilson the philosopher in Gilson the historian, who created an original philosophical synthesis. Gilson's synthesis consists of three interrelated convictions. First is the notion of Christian philosophy, which Gilson found as an observable reality in history. The notion fits quite comfortably into our own postmodern era that seeks to go beyond the modern presumption of Descartes to shrive his mind of societal and historical influences. Gilson's own doctoral work showed the futility of Descartes' attempt. In our contemporary era of postmodern pluralism, one is free to choose the starting points on which one's thinking is based. In the case of Christian philosophy, one's upbringing and habituation in Christian culture can allow for a theology to shape a philosophy, provided that it does not, as Gilson argued, enter into the fabric of the philosophy itself. Consequently, Christian philosophy certainly can stand alone before the court of reason as a type of philosophy in a postmodern age. Second is Gilson's contention that the so-called modern problem of knowledge is superfluous to the authentic thought of Thomas Aquinas and could be shown to be contradictory by destroying the epistemological realism it attempts to defend. Affected perhaps by a siege mentality and a desire to be philosophically respectable in the secular world, many Thomists wish to accept the challenge of modern thought by starting in universal doubt as to whether we can know the real, as Descartes proposed, or by following Kant and suspending our spontaneous convictions about actually knowing in our immediate experience a real world of existing things. Gilson maintained that as soon as contact with the world, with really existing things, is severed, and one starts from thought alone, one can never reunite with the world, despite the best of realistic interpretations, despite the best of realist intentions. One can never cross over the epistemological bridge from cognitional existence to real existence. Instead, Gilson defended a methodological realism in which sensible objects are given to us in thought as not dependent upon thought. The human mind immediately grasps both the reality, the existence, and the nature of an object. Gilson argued that sensation brings with itself an irresistible awareness that what it presents is something really existing outside of the mind. Sensible experience penetrated by the intellect provides us evidence certitude of the reality of the external world. Accusations that Gilson's realism is naive seem to be misplaced, since the doctrine as found in St. Thomas and Aristotle is both a profound and penetrating inquiry into human cognition. If Joseph Owens was correct, and I think he was, methodological realism remains valid today for understanding our own contemporary world, as well as for understanding any other world or any philosophy. Owens thought it was surprisingly up to date. Gilson's insistence that human knowledge yields a universe of things existing independently of our knowing laid the groundwork for the third component of his synthesis, namely the primacy of the act of existence, which constitutes the very heart of reality for St. Thomas. This conviction bends back on Gilson's notion of Christian philosophy and methodological realism. For Gilson, history shows that working as a theologian with the name of God as I am who am, from the book of Exodus, allowed St. Thomas to fashion both a metaphysics in which God's act of pure existence is his essence, from which all else that exists receives its sustenance, It also allowed him to fashion an epistemology in which knowing that which exists allows us to know that which is the effect of him who simply is existence per se. Because the act of existence is the deepest layer of reality, as well as the supreme attribute of the divinity, in its light we can continue to hold as true whatever is true in other philosophies without exception, and learn truths about God, nature, and man, which we can hold in no other way. Gilson considered Aquinas' existential metaphysics as the most profound and deepest interpretation of the notion of being that any philosophy has ever proposed. As one of the three components of Gilson's original synthesis, any one of the three components of Gilson's original synthesis, his philosophical realism and his existential metaphysics of being, as embedded in the bosom of Christian theology, would have sufficed to make Gilson a preeminent figure in 20th century thought. Placing Gilson's philosophical achievement in the larger context of his also founding a first-rate interdisciplinary institute and successfully providing medieval philosophy a scientific and institutional status allows one to more accurately situate him as an unparalleled giant in the field of medieval studies, a first-rate historian of philosophy, and a philosopher whose wide range of work resulted in an enduring contribution to philosophy itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Magnificent presentation. Awesome. I have to follow that. Don't give me that.
Okay. I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Tadeusz Kosinski. He's a professor of philosophy and academic dean in the Wyoming Catholic College. Tadeusz?
So switch gears a little bit and talk about the Benedict option after all that. Everybody familiar with that? Have you heard of that? It's sort of a cottage industry right now, writing interpretations and critiques of it. But I'd like to look at it, and I guess this follows from the great lecture we just heard about our concepts being measured by reality. The question is, in terms of spiritual reality that we're dealing with at this time, is the Benedict option a kind of effective God-willed strategy for the true spiritual reality we're encountering and we will encounter? Looking at the thought of Charles Taylor, particularly his idea of the immanent frame and his idea of a secular age, looking at the work of Rene Girard on apocalyptic violence as kind of an inevitable consequence of the rejection of the nonviolence of the God-man crucified, the divine scapegoat, and looking at finally the work of Guardini, Romano Guardini, towards the end of his great work, The End of the Modern World, where he paints a picture of mass culture and mass man and the kind of Christian witness and apologetics that will be required and that God will call us to. Looking at those three thinkers briefly, we can then assess the strategy of the Benedict option. I'm not going to condemn it and say it's not worth trying to have little sort of, having safe havens for the development of the family in peace and Christian culture. Of course, no one's against this. The question is whether such a strategy of kind of Benedict repairing to the desert, or Catholics and Christians repairing to our private ecclesial and spiritually potent and morally wholesome communities, will that be adequate is the question. Are we called to something more radical than that? And that's what I want to talk about. Joseph Szynski, in his great book, God and Postmodern Thought, writes the following, quote, "To live the faith of Abraham is to be ready at a day's notice, to pack the tents, symbolizing everything that is dear to one, and to go to a new unknown place, which God will indicate completely independently of rational calculations or our emotional predilections. To live the faith of Abraham in the cultural context of postmodernity is to be able calmly to pack up the tents of congenial concepts and arguments, not in order to set out on a desert path, but to set them up again in a different context and in a different form, in a place indicated by God. In an Abrahamic testimony of faith, one may not lose heart on account of the wildness of new places or on account of a feeling of loneliness in a foreign landscape. We must constantly seek the face of the Lord, listening carefully to his voice, which could be either a discreet whisper or a delicate breeze. We need to love God more than the logic of convincing deductions and the collection of respected authorities to which we like to refer in times of difficulty. We need to accept the provisionality of contingent means in order that the divine absolute might all the more clearly reveal in them his power. Only then does the contemporary wandering Aramaean reveal the style in which, amidst the darkness of our doubt, flashes the light of the great adventure of our faith." End quote. We need to accept the provisionality of contingent means. Consider that in your back of your mind as we proceed. I think Szynski's words are prophetic. We need to accept the provisionality of contingent means in order that the divine absolute might all the more clearly reveal in them his power. His words echo and confirm the thought of Romano Guardini, which we'll examine presently. If Guardini and Szynski are right about what it means to live in the fullness of the Abrahamic faith today, Catholic traditionalism in general, and the Benedict Option in particular, will be seen to be not adequate for living the life of faith, the fullness of faith in today's world, and enabling others to do the same. Why? For as Gilson might say, it's not the proper conceptual or theoretical response to the way things actually are. To help us see how things really are, or to present a view of our situation which shows that the Benedict option might not even be a real option, we'll look at Taylor, Girard, and Guardini. Taylor will show us the existential, Girard the political, and Guardini the spiritual. Taylor will teach us that modernity is in some way inescapable, Girard that our politics is in the final stages of the apocalypse, and Guardini that intimate union with God himself, with nothing in between, is no longer an option, but an absolute obligation and necessity. I don't think we'll answer all our questions today, but I do hope that we can maybe ask more questions or see if our questions and the way we ask them are adequate to the situation. There's a great quote by McIntyre where he sums up the problems with our culture. Quote, "We have within our social order few, if any, social milieus within which reflective and critical inquiry concerning the central issues of human life can be sustained. This tends to be a culture of answers, not of questions. And those answers, whether secular or religious, liberal or conservative, are generally delivered as though meant to put an end to questioning." It's a really incisive understanding of our problems, I think. A kind of fundamentalism on both sides. So Taylor first, and the immanent frame. Try to cut some of this out. It's hot and humid. So, yeah. So there's something ontological about modernity, according to Taylor. We're talking about a cultural and historical phenomena. And so we're not talking about being. Oh, oops, sorry, camera. So we're not talking about being itself. We're talking about a cultural and historical phenomena, but we are culturally dependent rational animals, to use MacIntyre's improvement on Aristotle's definition. We are the inexorable mediator of any pure being that we can experience. So we don't have this view from nowhere, pace the Enlightenment. We don't encounter reality unmediated by cultural artifacts, language, conceptual schemes, practices, narratives, norms that are embodied in social practices. We can transcend history and culture, of course, to attain timeless truth, but it's only through the cultural resources and productions that we both create and are created by that we do so. Louis Dupre, great philosopher of religion, writes the following: those who in a particular epoch impose a new pattern of meaning on the life and thought of their time do more than apply a different film of thought to a different reality. They transform the nature of reality itself. If the preceding carries any metaphysical weight, it would be contained in the original thesis that being must not be conceived as a substance moved by thought. Cultural changes leave a different reality in their wake. Culture, then, consists not in what humans add to the real, so to speak. It is the active component of the real itself, transforming the passive one, end quote. But then again, is modernity really neutral? Is it escapable, inescapable? We know that there have been anti-Christian fruits that appear to have grown solely in the soil of secular modernity. I could list many. It would seem to be an obligation to be against it, like the Benedict Option, whatever its ontological status. It would seem quite plausible that with enough prayer, education, and effort, by apprenticing oneself to the supreme culture-transcending teacher, the Catholic Church, by immersing oneself in the pristine and infallible formative hands of her, one could more or less escape modernity, at least those aspects of it that deny God and the transcendent in theory and in practice. Should we not create with Rod Dreher adequately anti-modern domestic, social, cultural, political, educational, and liturgical environments, especially if the ones that secular modernity has given us threaten our salvation? When you know what turned the tide for Dreher, I think, was Obergefell, right? I mean, before that, it was sort of like, let's use public reason, translate our Christian concepts into rationally plausible arguments for our values. And we're winning, we're doing well, look at all the things we've got. And then all of a sudden you get the Supreme Court decision which redefines moral reality for us. And I think at that point Dreher said, Benedict Option, it's not going to work anymore. And I'm very sympathetic with that idea. Reading MacIntyre, he was way ahead of Dreher, of course, and Dreher uses MacIntyre. So it's a very plausible sort of strategy when you have a kind of explicitly and more explicitly and systematically, programmatically anti-Christian politics and culture, then it would seem to be the right thing to do. But we'll get back to that. So here's what Charles Taylor says about the secular age. A secular age is one in which the eclipse of all goals beyond human flourishing becomes conceivable. Or, better, it falls within the range of an imaginable life for masses of people. He says, we have undergone a change in our condition, involving both an alteration of the structures we live within and our way of imaging these structures. We all share this, regardless of differences in outlook. What we share is what I've been calling the immanent frame. The different structures we live in, scientific, social, technological, and so on, constitute such a frame in that they are part of a natural or this worldly order, which can be understood in its own terms without reference to the supernatural or the transcendent. So according to Taylor, secular modernity is the ineluctable mode, background, and context for all thought and practice in the contemporary world. It's not simply a particular expression of certain viewpoints. It's a deeper reality than ideology. It's an existential reality. We encounter it deep within our lived experience of reality before we have a chance to reflect on it. It's not the reflective philosophical description or account we give ourselves of a more fundamental pre-philosophical, pre-reflective experience, but is itself this fundamental experience embodied in our lives in such a way that to attempt to disengage or extricate ourselves from it is equivalent to the attempt to escape reality itself. If this is the existential milieu we find ourselves in, this immanent frame, and if it's inescapable, then a Benedict Option community must at least reckon with this. It should not attempt to escape this mode of consciousness, medieval play acting or something, right? We're just going to set up certain visible, cultural, ecclesial, familial structures and, read the Baltimore Catechism and read pre-modern writings. But I mean, I'm caricaturing a bit, but you see this in the traditionalist movement a little bit, right? And we'll sort of surround ourselves with this and it'll be okay. We'll keep ourselves pure. We won't let the evil in. I think when you read Taylor, you realize there's something delusional about this. This would be futile. No matter how monastic and centered on God our practices and our community is, we cannot go back to the naive theistic consciousness of the medieval man. We are inevitably going to feel the pull of other worldviews and social imaginaries, to use Taylor's term. We simply have to accept the deep pluralism of our age. Accept it, not endorse it. And we could fight against it, but there's a way in which we have to accept it. Even if that pluralism often cloaks a homogeneous and stultifying immanentism, materialism, liberalism, and individualism. In other words, what Taylor is telling us is the Benedict Option is perhaps impossible if what is meant by that is a return to the medieval consciousness through the mere small-scale communal participation in traditional religious, cultural, and familial practices. We are free to still, and we should, when spiritually and morally urgent, create what we take to be anti-modern theoretical and practical constructs, as well as resist and reject the pernicious constructs of others, Obergefell, PC, whatever you want to call it. We must resist the mass culture of decadent, egoistic liberalism. But when we're doing that, Taylor would remind us, we must remember that these would be erected from within and by virtue of the pre-constructive consciousness that is secular modernity itself. We are in it. And when we make a choice to sort of create a, anachronistic cultural fortress for ourselves, we're doing that in virtue of modernity's, peculiar type of freedom, aren't we? So remember that, Taylor would say. All right, on to Rene Girard. Modernity as Apocalypse. All familiar with Girard? Rene Girard? I mean, I don't think so. Not everybody? Well, let's see. His works are prolific, complex. He's given us a rigorous psychological, anthropological, theological, and literary account of scapegoating. That's his main teaching, what that means in terms of myth and history and religion. And he's also given us a very, very persuasive analysis of the foundation of religion and culture and collective violence and ritualized murder. Girard has applied his formidable skill and erudition in literary criticism to the analysis of the myths that religious and cultural authorities employ to obscure their violence. Here's a summary of his project in his own words. Girard, quote, "My hypothesis is mimetic. It is because humans imitate each other more than animals that they have to find a way of overcoming a contagious similitude prone to causing the complete annihilation of their society. This mechanism, which reintroduces difference at the very moment when everyone becomes similar to one another, is sacrifice. Man is born of sacrifice and is thus a child of religion. What I call, following Freud, the foundational murder, namely the killing of a sacrificial victim, responsible for both the disorder and the restoration of order, has constantly been reenacted in rites and rituals which are at the origin of our institutions. Millions of innocent victims have thus been sacrificed since the dawn of humanity to allow their fellow men to live together, or more precisely, to not destroy themselves. Such is the implacable logic of the sacred, which the myths dissimulate less and less as man becomes more self-aware. The decisive moment of this evolution is Christian revelation, a sort of divine expiation in which God, in the person of his Son, will ask man for forgiveness for having waited so long to reveal to him the mechanisms of his violence. The rites, R-I-T-E-S, had slowly educated him. Now he was ready to do without them. It is Christianity that demystifies religion, and this demystification, while good in the absolute, proved to be bad in the relative, for we were not prepared to receive it. We are not Christian enough. One can formulate this paradox in another manner and say that Christianity is the only religion that will have foreseen its own failure. This prescience is called the apocalypse, end quote. Does that make you want to read Girard? Hope so. What Girard means by the apocalypse is not the event of divine judgment and retribution at the end of the world before the second coming of Christ. Girard himself interprets it anthropologically as the ever-escalating mimetic violence unto self-destruction that modern man is ineluctably inflicting upon himself in our corporate rejection of both the archaic violence-channeling sacrificial scapegoating of the pagan city and our rejection of the violence-destroying sacrifice of the divine scapegoat. Modernity is the graveyard of man's futile attempts to control his own violence, attempts occasioned by his growing awareness of his inability to generate and preserve culture through violence. Instead, man has staved off the escalating violence by his own artifices. These are the catechons in Greek, the buffers. Literally, in Greek, that which restrains. So when St. Paul says the son of darkness or something, or the enemy of man is now being restrained, but will be released or something, the word is catechon. So the modern catechons, is it the man of lawlessness? That's the phrase, isn't it? Yeah. He will be restrained by these things. For Girard, the modern buffers or catechons are things like the nation state, that's peacemaking, right? The judiciary system, vendetta canceling impartial judiciary, the free market of victimless exchanges, an endless supply of mass-produced consumer products, and violence and sex channeling entertainments. These are all ways to stave off the apocalypse for Girard. Yeah. Girard claims that the real possibility of apocalyptic violence was occasioned by the incarnation, death, and resurrection of the Son of God. He defeated the ancient model of channeling violence, but he gave no quarter to any mimetic model but himself. And this apocalyptic possibility has been actualizing itself ever since, and now to an exponential degree in late modernity. Modernity's soteriology, so to speak, is twofold, depending on one's perspective. For those who reject the divine scapegoat, modernity, with its programmatic rejection of all religious violence and its relentless, even fanatical, ideological concern for victims, is precisely what saves us from the apocalypse. For those who accept his nonviolent atonement, modernity is nothing else but the apocalypse's inevitability. Here's Girard again. Quote, "The trend towards the apocalypse is humanity's greatest feat. The more probable this achievement becomes, the less we talk about it. I have always been utterly convinced that violence belongs to a form of corrupted sacred, intensified by Christ's action when he placed himself at the heart of the sacrificial system. Satan is the other name of the escalation to extremes. The passion has radically altered the archaic world. Satanic violence has long reacted against this holiness, which is an essential transformation of ancient religion. In spite of modernity's catechons having performed their restraining functions for hundreds of years, there's still much mimetic violence, perhaps more than ever. The prolongation and escalation of violence and millions upon millions of human sacrificial victims, the unborn, the elderly, the handicapped, the poor and the middle class in the first world, the vast majority in the third world, religiously, culturally, and intellectually starved souls, the normalization of political propaganda, pathological violence, plasticized sex and media and entertainment, massive private indebtedness, masses of brave New World soma addicts, the so-called collateral damage of millions of innocents in perpetual epic-scale wars started by false flag terror events, the perpetual fear and terror of the national security and surveillance state, wars and rumors of wars, the renewed threat of nuclear Armageddon. You can see why maybe the Benedict option is not going to fix all that. Scapegoating in the contemporary Western world has not just continued, but has both escalated beyond control and cloaked itself in an all but unrecognizable form. The concern for victims. The politically correct on the left persecute those they deem the persecutors in the name of the persecuted. The terrorists of the right terrorize those they deem the terrorists in the name of the victims of terror. Victims by terrorists such as ISIS. What is particularly apocalyptic about this new secular post-Christian scapegoating violence is that we're in denial. We know not what we do. And each person and state actor insists upon the cosmic righteousness of his use of violence and the demonic depravity of his enemies, all in the name of the concern for victims. Contemporary politics, in other words, is not going to save us now. And while dropping out from it in Benedict option communities might protect us from its contagion for a while, it is akin to hiding out in a safe room on the Titanic. Okay. In short, Rene Girard identifies modern politics as fundamentally a system of satanic world-destroying, scapegoating violence. If Girard is correct, while we can protect ourselves from the spiritual contagion of scapegoating by unwavering obedience to and identification with the divine scapegoat, the apocalyptic political violence Girard foresees will not be forestalled by Benedict option communities. We will not ultimately be protected from it wherever we go. Only a national and even global-wide rejection of scapegoating, which requires full conversion to the nonviolence of the gospel, only that will suffice to prevent the man-made apocalypse we're already witnessing. And finally, Guardini and the End of Modernity. In his book, The End of the Modern World, written in 1956, the great Italian-born and German-educated Catholic theologian Romano Guardini wrote, quote, "The new age will declare that the secularized facets of Christianity are sentimentalities. This declaration will clear the air. The world to come will be filled with animosity and danger, but it will be a world open and clean. As unbelievers deny revelation more decisively, as they put their denial into more consistent practice, it will become the more evident what it really means to be a Christian. At the same time, the unbeliever will emerge from the fogs of secularism. He will cease to reap benefit from the values and forces developed by the very revelation he denies. He must learn to exist honestly without Christ and without the God revealed through him. He will have to learn to experience what this honesty means. Nietzsche has already warned us that the non-Christian of the modern world had no realization of what it meant to be without Christ. The last decades have suggested what life without Christ really is. The last decades were only the beginning." End quote. Guardini described a world in the 50s similar to the one Rod Dreher describes now, one of a neo-pagan totalitarianism that's no longer tolerating any threats to its secularist, atheist, and humanist dogmas, Obergefell. One in which Christians and other theists are called to brook no compromise and live out their faith all the more integrally and heroically. But Guardini's prescription for action is something at once more bracing and consoling than Dreher's. For Guardini, nothing but, quote, "the free union of the human person with the absolute through unconditional freedom will enable the faithful to stand firm, God-centered, even though placeless and unprotected. Only the free union of the human person with the absolute through unconditional freedom will enable the faithful to stand God-centered, even though placeless and unprotected." That does not sound like the Benedict option. Placeless and unprotected. It sounds more like, I was just thinking before I got up here, has anyone seen the Book of Eli? Okay, that's like more like what Guardini's telling us about. Except instead of this amazing violence, is it Denzel Washington in that? Yeah. Instead of this ridiculous violence, he kills everybody. It'll be spiritual warfare, but the same naked, isolated, apocalypse, Mad Max type of situation. I mean, that's more like what Guardini's pointing to. A bunch of Denzel Washingtons around being these like sources of miraculous grace everywhere. So Guardini goes on, quote, loneliness and faith will be terrible. Loneliness and faith will be terrible. Love will disappear from the face of the public world. But the more precious will be that love that flows from one lonely person to another, involving a courage of the heart born from the immediacy of the love of God as it was made known in Christ. Perhaps love will achieve an intimacy and harmony never known to this day, he says. So where sin abounds, right? Grace abounds more. In short, end quote, Guardini sees no real possibility for safe havens of Christian culture. And even if we could create them, they might have the potential of stunting our spiritual growth, keeping us kind of at a certain level of Christian holiness and mystical communion with God. Maybe they'll be sort of crutches for us in a sense. It seems to me, reading Guardini in light of Girard, light of Taylor, and other mystical thinkers of today and the past, that God is calling us Christians and all theists to a higher level of consciousness, of awareness of God, of the moment, of the present moment, of being, a kind of union with reality that's more than just mere orthodoxy and orthopraxy. A heroic and mystical level of faith, obedience, and trust. Unshakable, naked union with God. Not just knowledge about God, but the experience, personal experience, intimate, deep, absolutely certain experience of God's presence is what God's calling us. And he's always been calling us to that, but maybe he's forcing it now, in a sense, right? Unshakable, naked union with Christ, able to show forth this union wherever we go, to everyone we meet. And like Christ, perhaps we will have nowhere to lay our heads. So what, Benedict option or mandatory mysticism? Couldn't resist that. What Taylor, Girard, and Guardini are telling us is both worse and better than Dreher's description of our situation. It's worse in the sense that although the Benedict option is a crucial strategy for theists, everyone should try to shore up socially inviolable and wholesome and orthodox founded communities. Of course, that's my college is that. It's a Benedict option, basically. It's a crucial strategy, but it very well might not be possible in the future, in the near future. If Taylor is right, the immanent frame is our permanent home. And if Girard is right, well, not permanent, but at least for the time, maybe the next 200 or 300 years, something like that. I don't know. And if Girard is right, the escalating apocalyptic violence will make any attempt to construct safe havens of Catholic culture that are spiritually and physically immune to the contagion of violence and scapegoating perhaps delusional. But if Guardini is right, our situation is a gift, a priceless treasure. For God will give each of us who ask for it the grace to endure the darkness, the barbarism, and the loss of our customary, sensible, and cultural and ecclesial signs of God's love and presence. We will emerge from this purgation with our idols and our crutches and our safety nets broken and useless. Remember Zazinski's quote at the outset, quote, "We need to accept the provisionality of contingent means in order that the divine absolute might all the more clearly reveal in them his power. Thus, we will be able to know God as he is, experience him as much as finite creatures can through grace, and be conduits for his inexorable love, which will conquer all and save all. I think we have to listen to David Walsh's quote here and take it seriously, the political philosopher. Only someone who has broken out of the restricted horizon of ideology can see clearly what has been left behind. Only those who have fully contemplated the abyss, only those who have fully contemplated the abyss can be sure of having attained a spiritual truth capable of overcoming it. End quote. We can surely try to opt out of the decaying culture and to shore up theistic culture in small enclaves of like-minded devotees of tradition and the transcendent. But whatever we do, we must do the one thing necessary, as Mary did at the feet of Jesus, while Martha was busy with other things she thought more important. Mary knelt and adored and experienced Christ. We must all become mystics now, in intimate and real contact with God, so we can be his hands, heart, and voice in our ever-darkening world. I've been reading Karl Rahner lately. I know that he has a controversial and he's troubling among the conservative and the Orthodox, but his mystical writings are phenomenal, and his writings about the nature of the future church, he talks exactly like Guardini about the way in which people will have to, he said, okay, I don't know if you know this, but he said, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or he will not be at all. Karl Rahner said that. And I think he was right. Listen to this quote from Rahner in his mystical writing. This is a meditation on Lent. Quote, "Do not despair when experiencing despair. Let the despair take all from you, since what is taken from you is only the finite, the unimportant, even if it may have been ever so wonderful and so great, even if it may be yourself and your ideals with your smart and detailed plans for your life, with your image of a God that looks more like you than the incomprehensible one. Allow all the exits to be blocked, for they are only exits into the finite and paths into dead ends. Do not be frightened by the solitude and forsakenness in your internal prison, which appears to be dead as a grave. For if you stand firm, refusing to flee from despair, and in the despair over the loss of your former idol that you call God, you do not doubt the true God, if you stand firm, which is a true miracle of grace, then you will realize suddenly that your grave-like prison cell is locked up only against what is meaningless and finite, that its deathly emptiness is only the vastness of God's presence, that silence is filled with a word without words by the one who stands above all names and who is all in all. The silence is his silence. He is saying that he is here. He is here." End quote. So I'll end with another quote from a paper, an essay of one of my students. We had this course called Modernity and Postmodernity. It's a humanities course, and we read Joseph Conrad, Albert Camus, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. On the one hand, on the other hand, we read Dostoevsky, Eliot, O'Connor, and Girard, and it was a nice course. And I mean, these are students who have been reading Augustine and Thomas and Dante, and then all of a sudden, senior year, they get this. And it's bracing for some of them. Some of them really have a hard time with Joseph Conrad, especially with Camus, The Stranger. An existentially difficult time with this. They've never encountered anything like it. But I try to take them through it. Don't despair in your despair, right? You know. And this is what one student said in a paper at the end. "Living in the modern era is a gift. Despite the broken traditions, abolished communities, and heap of worn-out philosophies, this era is still a gift. In one way, man can no longer distract himself with human constructs." Whoa, she got that, you know. In one way, man can no longer distract himself with human constructs. They have all failed. And anyone who lives in denial of this failure will be forced to face tragedy at some point, like the grandmother in A Good Man is Hard to Find, even if that point only comes at his or her own death. In another way, man is called to even more intimate encounter with God as a result of this wasteland. They read the wasteland. Quite literally, and then the four quartets after that. Man is called to even more intimate encounter with God as a result of this wasteland. Quite literally, we have been placed in a society that purges us of pride and confidence in human accomplishment. The disparity of the wasteland calls for deeper love and communion, but God provides a more intimate way of encountering himself to overshadow this disparity. And this is a gift. End quote. So that's it. Thank you.
We have refreshments that I think have been delivered. If you'd like to go get some coffee and stuff, then bring it back and have a question.
Yeah, I love it. Great.
So that is the overlapping Awesome. Oh, thank you. Awesome. Appreciate it. So we can't say kumbaya no more. You want kumbaya?
And those people that I actually felt bad for, they were angry, they were upset, they didn't do anything about it. I'm not a review.
Yeah, you're like, I had a full-time teacher. I was at the Montfort Academy. I still helped start that. It was a guitar verse, which verse. So I was head master.
But after all, they're used to the same
It was
language.
a job for a private tutor.
Each of us using the same language. That's great. Well, this is great.
It's like, it turns out.
Say the same thing.
We had 5 kids.
Yeah. I just thought, I was just I mentioned this specific. So you know these guys, Girard.
Somehow I got that job.
It'll come up later. Yes, that's funny. She was like, I'm not that good for me.
Are you teaching about?
Yeah, I will. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, let's go. I taught one person last summer. I did Reason and Revelation. It was that one teacher.
The only reason one Girard has any words. He is poster boy for ending humanity.
As I said, despite my presentation, I feel like I've done even half. So there are all these other people, or even other people.
This is amazing bibliography applied by this conference.
Yeah, it's just the bibliography of what you're doing.
It's very hard. And it ain't over yet.
It is hard.
Ain't over yet.
I like that shortcut for Teal, the poster boy for him. I was gonna say, I'll found my Facebook. Easier.
He claims that he is responsible for the fact that there's no thumbing out. If there was one to trip from the field.
Deal says he didn't want to thumbs down.
Yes,
He only wanted a thumbs
that was up. And Girard is the reason why.
Right, Godfather of the like button.
Correct. So a thumbs down would be violent.
Not mimetic.
Right. Or just trying to tilt a minute, field.
Right. And now there are, I believe, 7 motions that you can select.
One of which is rainbow motion. And various people have noted that they never had it. Some people said they had it.
What do you do?
Yeah, some people got it, some people never got it.
Well, that makes sense.
Other people came. They did that with 5 weeks. These measuring people's devotion to virtue.
Oh, apologies.
You know, they did one for thankfulness too.
Oh, I know that.
I understand.
So, okay, let me get
So I don't know if this is an appropriate question for the group or not. You tell me. Is this an appropriate question for the group? And
Well, it's another question. Oh, okay.
So let's actually have 2 questions. You tell me what you want me to ask. I'm going to have both group. In part because you made quick, I'm not that appropriate. In part because you don't want to answer them or embarrassing. The first question for you is the comments on Henri Leibach's publishing of one-sided correspondence between himself and Gilson with a whole bunch of his edited notes. It really seems to me to be profoundly invasion of privacy and unfair. But your reaction would be one question, so that's number one, if you want to talk to the group about that. And secondly, Peter and I have been trying to track down the source of an error in our country. About this guy.
Oh, okay, country club first, Catholic second?
And so the question is,
Okay.
it gets pretty strong. So this is from Bank Station.
Joseph wrote about him.
Well, the answer is Peter has found, yes. They'll start citations of him. But my guess is that it's obscure, so obscure that it would be inappropriate to ask you what you think about Gilson's comments about him. This is not me. Yes.
Yeah.
Peter knows a little bit of reference.
Yeah.
You can have that. I just feel that. That's the reference.
So I can ask you about Leibach? If you want to find out.
Doesn't always happen that
Other than
I kind of, it takes the conversion more. It takes, he's surprised those all kinds of ways.
and supernatural.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I will leave your answer for Peter's. In fact, I will throw in Dreher.
oh, that's an
It's a girl, 900
There.
kids in the grad school class. One guy.
This is.
This was in the 60s when we had long hair. This guy had
Professor of
kind of a
the
buzz cut.
Paris.
And he was known as the one really Christian guy who read the Bible.
He was 15th century.
He was kind of non-denominational.
Yes. Unfavorably, and so the.
He's like, when you think of uncool, that's
Sure.
really the definition of
Is-
uncool, right? Back
Where do
in
you
the
think?
days.
Why do you find a homeless negative view about Pearson?
And
Lines up.
because everybody wanted this guy home.
Via Bernard Moore's mind.
And he happened to be a hockey goalie that was really good.
Well, I don't know.
And it's, but they picked this guy because they
Yeah.
respected
I'll leave that
him
aside.
in ways that, you know, and he wasn't the cool guy that everybody, even the guy you wanted to get to know. But he was the guy.
I got it. We're at the stand.
It's all training. A lot of guys don't have so many things agree with it. They came up from the military or whatever, however they got this. Yeah, definitely. You're running this thing, John. Remember that the eight steps to organization. Yeah.